Hi, it's Hobie1. This is Red Share Reading. No red share again today. I'm out in Ansel Hoffman Park by the beautiful American River. Today we're reading the Black Book of Secrets by F.E. Higgins. Chapter 28, Perigoe Leafbinder. Let's go. Perigoe Leafbinder had been in the book business for over 30 years. As she liked to remind anyone who came into her shop, and if a book had been printed, she knew about it. Perigoe made a reasonable living, but not necessarily from the locals. Despite there being little else to do in the dark evenings but read, few had acquired the skill. She operated a very efficient delivery service by means of a horse and trap to the north side of the city, where lived the rich and idle, who bought books purely to demonstrate their style and intellectual superiority. Perigoe had learned early that it was not difficult to make money out of other people's vanity. She was a small woman, almost a dwarf, with a pinched face and a rather crooked smile. In recent months, her left eye had developed an irritating twitch, which increased when she was nervous, a state she was in most of the time, with the result that she was constantly winking. Her flared nostrils supported a pair of round spectacles, almost as if they had been designed for the purpose. They made the arms of her spectacles redundant, for they never fell off even when she bent over. Since her husband's death some 3 years previously, Perigoe had taken to wearing black almost exclusively and, given her size and apparel, was often difficult to see in the dim light. She took great pleasure in emerging from dark corners and tapping browsers on the back, making them jump. Joe entered the shop, leaving Ludlow outside, and stood for some minutes in the silence surveying his surroundings. He had to stoop somewhat, and when he took his hat off, his wild hair brushed the oak beams that traversed the ceiling. The walls were shelved, and freestanding bookcases stood close together in parallel lines across the floor. Joe walked between them, running his long fingers across the dark spines of the books. There seemed no particular order to the place. Novels sat beside scientific works, art beside mathematics, antiquarian volumes beside new. Perigoe appeared as if from nowhere, and poked him with a wizened forefinger. "Mr. Zabbidou, I believe." Her voice was almost inaudible. Perigoe always spoke as if she thought someone was eavesdropping. "Indeed I am," replied Joe. "A pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Leafbinder." He took her bloodless hand in his, and kissed it with great ceremony. Perigoe allowed her hand to linger, remembering for an instant a time when she might have blushed at such a gesture. "How may I help you?" she asked, and winked 3 times. "I seek a book," said Joe, "about animals, amphibians in particular, by S.E. Salter. I was hoping you might possess such a volume." "Well, I believe I do," said Perigoe, and glided across the floor, almost as if she were not in possession of feet, to find it. She returned quickly and handed a book to Joe, a slim volume with a hard cover and color plates. He held it firmly between thumb and forefinger and looked her deep in the eyes. Perigoe found it difficult to avert her gaze from his. "I thought you might wish to share a drink with me," he suggested. "Tonight, perhaps?" Perigoe nodded slowly, and her eyes flapped like a sheet in the wind. She wanted to look away, but for some reason she was unable. Soft music filled her head like early morning birdsong, and her bony fingertips were beginning to prickle as if she had been stung by nettles. "At midnight?" Perigoe nodded again. "Until then," said Joe, breaking the spell, and he went to the door. He held up the book. "How much do I owe you?" Perigoe's heart was fluttering like a trapped moth, and she had to steady herself on a shelf. "There's no charge," she whispered. Joe reached for the doorknob as a dark shadow on the other side filled the frame. He could hear the sound of heavy breathing, and moments later, Jeremiah Ratchet burst in like an over-fermented bottle of ale, popping its cork. When he saw Joe, he snorted scornfully. Joe merely stepped back to allow him entrance, tipped his hat in greeting, and slipped out without a backward glance. As they made their way back to the shop, Ludlow wondered what business Jeremiah had with Perigoe. Surely he was not a man of letters. Ludlow tried to read the title of the book Joe now held, something about amphibians, but it was obscured by the folds of his cloak. If this is interesting to you, please be sure to boop the like button. You'll help the video spread to other people. And thank you very much. To the outsider, compared with most others in the village, Perigoe Leafbinder had a good life. She ran a successful business and did not want for money. She had enjoyed her married life, and now she was equally satisfied with widowhood. But still she stood under the 3 golden orbs at midnight, like so many of her fellow Pegasparvians. She harbored a ruinous secret that would not leave her be. She raised her arm in the light of the expectant 3/4 moon. Joe opened the door before she could knock. "Mrs. Leafbinder," he said pleasantly. "I've been expecting you." Perigoe glided in silently, and Joe led her to the back of the room. "So what is it you do up here late at night?" she asked, and her eyelid twitched rapidly. "I buy secrets." Perigoe adjusted her spectacles nervously as she considered what he had just said. Finally, she said, "I have a secret I'd like to sell. Will you take it?" "But of course," replied Joe, and handed her a glass. "I am sure that any secret of yours would be of the highest quality and would be worth a good sum of money." Perigoe blushed and winked twice, took a small sip of the syrupy liquid, and began. Thus ends Chapter 28. Thank you very much for joining me. I'll see you again in Chapter 29.